The summer of 1987 was like any other for the British royal family, filled with carefully planned events and proper protocols. But on one particular day at London's Middlesex Hospital, everything changed when Princess Diana did something no royal had ever done before. The AIDS crisis was at its peak and fear surrounded the disease. Most people believed you could catch it just by touching someone who had it. Hospitals were like forbidden zones and patients felt abandoned by society. The royal visit to the AIDS ward was supposed to be a standard appearance, smile, wave, maybe say a few words from a safe distance. Diana arrived at the hospital wearing her usual elegant outfit, but something was different about her demeanor that day. The hospital staff had prepared everything according to royal protocol. They expected her to maintain the traditional distance, perhaps shake hands with the doctors and administrators, and leave after taking some photographs. When Diana entered the ward, she saw patients lying in their beds, some barely able to lift their heads. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable. These were people who had been rejected by their own families, abandoned by friends, and treated like outcasts by society. The medical staff stood nervously nearby, unsure of what would happen next. Then Diana did something that shocked everyone in the room. She walked directly to the bedside of a young man named Ivan who was clearly very ill. Without hesitation, without gloves, and without any protection, she reached out and took his hand in hers. The room fell completely silent. Ivan's eyes filled with tears as the future Queen of England held his hand and spoke to him gently. She asked about his day, his treatment, and how he was feeling. She listened carefully to his answers, never once pulling away or showing any sign of discomfort. For those precious minutes, she wasn't a princess. She was simply a caring human being. The photographers in the room were stunned. They had expected formal poses and distant handshakes, but here was Diana, breaking every rule of royal protocol. The images they captured that day would change history. The sight of a member of the royal family touching an AIDS patient without fear sent a powerful message around the world. News of Diana's gesture spread quickly through the hospital, and then, across Britain, the media, initially shocked by her boldness, soon realized the importance of what had happened. This wasn't just about breaking protocol. It was about breaking down barriers of fear and prejudice that had surrounded AIDS patients for years. Diana spent over an hour in the ward that day, moving from bed to bed, holding hands, offering comfort, and treating each patient with dignity and respect. She spoke to their partners, their friends, and their caregivers. She listened to their stories and shared in their struggles. By the time she left, the entire atmosphere of the ward had changed. The patients felt human again. For the first time in months, some of them smiled. They had been touched by royalty, literally and figuratively, and it gave them hope they hadn't felt in a long time. The medical staff were amazed by the transformation they witnessed. These were the same patients who had been withdrawn and depressed just hours earlier. Outside the hospital, crowds had gathered after hearing about what was happening inside. When Diana emerged, the applause was different from the usual polite clapping that greeted royal appearances. This was genuine appreciation for something much more meaningful than ceremony. The impact of Diana's actions that day extended far beyond the hospital walls. Across Britain and around the world, people began to reconsider their attitudes toward AIDS patients. If the Princess of Wales could touch them without fear, perhaps they weren't as dangerous as everyone thought. Medical experts seized the opportunity to educate the public about how AIDS was actually transmitted. In the days that followed, donations to AIDS research and support organizations increased dramatically. Families who had rejected their loved ones began to reach out. Hospitals reported that the stigma surrounding AIDS patients was beginning to diminish. Volunteers started coming forward to help care for those affected by the disease. Diana's decision to break character that day wasn't planned by her staff or approved by palace officials. It came from her heart, and it showed the world a different side of royalty. She proved that being royal didn't mean being distant or untouchable. Sometimes it meant being more human than anyone expected. The young man whose hand she held first, Ivan, later said that moment gave him the strength to keep fighting his illness. He lived several more years than doctors had predicted, and he often spoke about how Diana's touch had restored his will to live. He wasn't the only one. Many patients from that ward credited Diana's visit with giving them hope during their darkest hours. This single act of compassion marked the beginning of a new era for the royal family. Diana had shown that sometimes the most powerful thing a royal could do was to ignore the rules and simply be human. She had broken character in the most beautiful way possible. And in doing so, she had revealed the true character that lay beneath the crown. The image of Diana holding an AIDS patient's hand became one of the most iconic photographs of the 1980s. It captured a moment when protocol was abandoned in favor of humanity, when fear was overcome by love, and when one person's courage changed the world's perspective on an entire community of suffering people. Years later, AIDS charities would credit that single moment with helping to transform public attitudes toward the disease and those who suffered from it. Diana had proven that sometimes breaking character was exactly what the world needed to see from its leaders. The year was 2002, and Queen Elizabeth II had ruled Britain for 50 years. She was known for her stoic demeanor, her unwavering composure, and her ability to remain calm in any situation. The British people had come to expect their monarch to be a pillar of strength, someone who never showed weakness or vulnerability. But on one September day, all of that changed. The Queen was attending the memorial service for the victims of the September 11th attacks at St. Paul's Cathedral. The entire nation was mourning alongside America, and the cathedral was filled with dignitaries, politicians, and ordinary citizens who had come to pay their respects. The Queen sat in her usual place, dressed in black, her expression composed, and dignified as always. The service began with prayers and hymns, all carefully chosen to honor the nearly 3,000 people who had lost their lives in the terrorist attacks. The Queen participated in the service as she had in thousands of others throughout her reign, with grace, respect, and perfect protocol. Nothing seemed different from any other formal occasion. Then came the moment that would be remembered forever. A young American woman named Sarah, whose brother had died in the World Trade Center, was invited to read a personal tribute. She walked slowly to the podium, her hands shaking as she held the piece of paper containing her words. Sarah began to speak about her brother Michael, a firefighter who had rushed into the burning towers to save others. Her voice was steady at first, but as she described his love for his family, his dedication to helping people, and the last phone call he had made to his wife, her composure began to break. The cathedral was completely silent as Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. She spoke about Michael's 3 young children, who would grow up without their father. She described how he had coached their soccer team, how he read them bedtime stories, and how he always made them laugh. The pain in her voice was unbearable. As Sarah continued reading, tears began streaming down her face. She struggled to get the words out, pausing frequently to compose herself. The entire congregation was moved by her raw grief and love for her brother. Many people in the cathedral began to cry themselves, touched by the depth of her loss. Queen Elizabeth, sitting in the front row, watched Sarah intently. For decades, the Queen had maintained perfect composure at thousands of public events. She had been trained from childhood never to show emotion in public, to always be the steady presence her people could rely on. But as she listened to Sarah's heartbreaking tribute, something inside her began to change. Sarah's voice broke completely as she read her brother's final words to his family. She had to stop speaking for several moments, overcome by grief. Wow. Silence in the cathedral was deafening, and everyone could feel the weight of her pain. It was at this moment that something unprecedented happened. Queen Elizabeth's eyes began to fill with tears. At first, she tried to maintain her composure, blinking rapidly and keeping her chin up. But as Sarah continued to speak about her brother's sacrifice and love, the Queen could no longer control her emotions. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. The cameras captured every moment, and the images would later appear on front pages around the world. Here was the woman who had remained, stoic through wars, scandals, and national tragedies, crying openly in public. The sight was both shocking and deeply moving to everyone who witnessed it. The Queen made no attempt to hide her tears or leave the service. She sat there, allowing her emotions to show, proving that even monarchs were human. Her tears weren't just for the victims of 9/11. They were for all the mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters who had lost loved ones in senseless acts of violence. After Sarah finished her tribute and returned to her seat, the Queen did something else that surprised everyone. She rose from her place and walked over to where Sarah was sitting. Without saying a word, she took Sarah's hands in hers and squeezed them gently. The two women looked into each other's eyes, sharing a moment of pure human connection that transcended all boundaries of nationality, class, and protocol. The Queen's gesture meant everything to Sarah. Later, she would say that having the Queen cry with her and comfort her made her feel less alone in her grief. It showed her that her brother's sacrifice was recognized and honored by people around the world, including the most powerful woman in Britain. The British public's reaction to seeing their Queen cry was overwhelmingly positive. Instead of seeing it as weakness, they saw it as proof of her humanity and compassion. Letters poured into Buckingham Palace from people who said they loved their Queen even more after seeing her show such genuine emotion. The media, which often criticized the royal family for being out of touch, praised the Queen for her authentic response to tragedy. Editorial writers noted that her tears proved she truly understood the pain of ordinary people, and that she cared deeply about the suffering of others. In the weeks that followed, the Queen received thousands of letters from around the world. Many came from people who had lost loved ones and found comfort in knowing that even the Queen understood their pain. Others thanked her for showing that it was okay to cry, that showing emotion wasn't a sign of weakness but of strength and humanity. That day at St. Paul's Cathedral marked a turning point in how the British people viewed their monarch. They had always respected her duty and dedication, but now they also saw her heart. The Queen had broken character in the most human way possible, and in doing so, she had connected with her people on a level that no amount of protocol or ceremony could achieve. The moment also changed how the Queen approached future public appearances. While she remained dignified and composed, she allowed more of her personality and emotions to show through. The wall between monarch and subject became a little lower, and the relationship between the Queen and her people became more genuine and heartfelt. The year was 2017, and Prince William was attending a routine charity event for mental health awareness. As second in line to the throne, he was expected to give a polished speech, shake hands with donors, and pose for photographs. Mental health had become one of his key causes, but like most royal engagements, this was supposed to be a carefully managed affair with prepared remarks and scripted interactions. The venue was a community center in East London, filled with mental health advocates, patients, families, and healthcare workers. William had attended dozens of similar events, always maintaining the perfect balance of royal dignity and genuine concern. His staff had prepared talking points, and the schedule was mapped out to the minute. Everything started according to plan. William arrived punctually, was introduced to key organizers, and began his walkabout through the crowd. He spoke with doctors about treatment programs, listened to success stories from patients in recovery, and thanked volunteers for their dedication. The cameras followed his every move, capturing the usual royal moments of engagement and interest. Then, William was introduced to a young father named James, whose teenage son had taken his own life 6 months earlier. James had been reluctant to attend the event, but his wife had convinced him that maybe talking to someone in authority might help him process his grief and possibly prevent other families from experiencing the same tragedy. When William approached James, he expected another brief, polite conversation like the dozens he'd already had that day. But as soon as James began to speak about his son, something shifted in the atmosphere. James's voice was thick with pain as he described his 15-year-old son Tommy, who had been struggling with depression, but had hidden it well from his family. James explained how Tommy had been a bright, funny kid who loved football and video games. He had friends, did well in school, and seemed to have everything going for him. But behind his smile, Tommy was fighting a battle that his family never saw coming. The warning signs were there, James realized later, but at the time they seemed like normal teenage behavior. As James continued talking, his composure began to break. He described finding his son's room empty one morning and the devastating realization that followed. He spoke about the guilt that consumed him, wondering if he could have done something different, said something that might have saved his child's life. William, who was supposed to offer brief words of comfort and move on to the next person, found himself completely absorbed in James's story. The protocol forgotten, he stood there listening intently as this grieving father poured out his heart. The cameras captured every moment, but William seemed oblivious to their presence. Then James asked William a question that changed everything. "Your Royal Highness," he said, his voice breaking, "you're going to be king someday, and you'll have children who will grow up in the public eye. How do you sleep at night knowing that you might not be able to protect them from their own minds?" The question hit William like a physical blow. In that moment, all the royal training, all the carefully crafted public persona, all the protective barriers he had built around his emotions came crashing down. Here was a father asking him the question that kept him awake at night, the fear that every parent carries about their children's well-being. William's eyes filled with tears as he looked at James. The room around them seemed to fade away as the prince struggled to find words. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely different from the polished royal tone everyone was used to hearing. "I don't sleep well some nights," William admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lie awake thinking about George and Charlotte, wondering if I'll be able to see the signs if they're struggling. I wonder if the pressure of being royal will make it harder for them to come to me when they need help." The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Here was the future king, admitting his fears and vulnerabilities in front of a room full of strangers and cameras. Royal protocol had never prepared anyone for this level of raw honesty from a member of the royal family. William continued, his composure completely gone now. "I lost my mother when I was 15, he said, his voice shaking. "I know what it's like to feel like the world is ending and not know how to ask for help. The idea that my children might go through something similar, and that I might miss it like your family missed it with Tommy, it terrifies me." James reached out and put his hand on William's arm, a gesture that would have been unthinkable under normal royal protocol. But this wasn't a normal moment. Two fathers were connecting over their deepest fears and pain, and social conventions seemed irrelevant. "The truth is," William continued, wiping his eyes, "I don't have all the answers. I'm just a father trying to do his best, hoping that love will be enough to keep his children safe. Some nights I check on them 3 or 4 times just to make sure they're okay." The room was completely silent, except for the sound of people crying. Healthcare workers, who had dedicated their lives to mental health support, were moved by the prince's honesty. Parents in the crowd recognized their own fears reflected in his words. William spent the next hour talking with James, abandoning his schedule completely. They discussed the warning signs of depression, the importance of open communication between parents and children, and the need for better mental health resources in schools. It wasn't a royal engagement anymore. It was a conversation between two fathers trying to make sense of a world where children sometimes suffer in silence. The media coverage of William's breakdown was extensive, but unlike other times when royals had shown emotion, this was universally praised. Mental health advocates said his honesty would encourage other parents to have difficult conversations with their children. The Samaritans reported a significant increase in calls from both parents and young people in the days following the event. More importantly, William's moment of vulnerability changed how the royal family approached mental health advocacy. Instead of keeping their involvement at arm's length, they began sharing more personal experiences and showing more authentic emotion when discussing these issues. James later said that William's honesty had helped him in his grief journey. Knowing that even the future king struggled with the same fears and worries made him feel less alone. The two men stayed in contact, and James became an advocate for mental health awareness, inspired by William's courage in showing his true feelings. That day, December 23, 2018, was supposed to be a quiet day for Prince Harry. Christmas was just around the corner, and he was preparing for the traditional royal celebrations at Sandringham. His schedule was clear, his bags were packed, and he was looking forward to spending time with his new wife Meghan and the rest of the royal family. Then his private secretary received an urgent phone call that would change everything. A devastating fire had torn through a block of apartments in a working-class neighborhood of London, leaving 43 families homeless just 2 days before Christmas. The building had been completely destroyed, and residents had escaped with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The local council was struggling to find emergency accommodation for so many families during the holiday season. Hotels were booked, temporary housing was limited, and many of the displaced residents were elderly or had young children. The situation was desperate, and traditional charity organizations were overwhelmed by the scale of the emergency. Harry's first instinct was to make a donation through his charitable foundation. It was the typical royal response: write a check, issue a statement of support, and let the proper authorities handle the crisis. But something about the timing, so close to Christmas, and the thought of children waking up homeless on Christmas morning, struck him deeply. Instead of heading to Sandringham as planned, Harry made a decision that shocked his staff and security team. He called off his Christmas preparations and announced that he was going directly to the fire site to see how he could help personally. His protection officers scrambled to arrange security, while his private secretary tried to explain why this wasn't a good idea. Harry arrived at the scene still wearing the casual clothes he had planned to travel in: jeans, a sweater, and a baseball cap. There was no formal reception committee, no prepared speeches, and no media event organized. He simply walked up to the Red Cross tent that had been set up as an emergency center and asked what needed to be done. The volunteer coordinator, a woman named Patricia, didn't recognize him at first. When she realized who he was, she was so flustered she nearly dropped the clipboard she was holding. Harry quickly put her at ease, rolling up his sleeves and asking for a job assignment like any other volunteer. For the next several hours, Harry worked alongside Red Cross volunteers and local residents, helping to sort donated clothing, preparing meals, and most importantly, talking with the displaced families. He listened to their stories, played with frightened children, and helped elderly residents fill out insurance forms. One family that particularly touched Harry was the Johnsons, a grandmother caring for her 3 young grandchildren whose parents were deployed overseas with the military. Mrs. Johnson had lost everything in the fire, including the Christmas presents she had been hiding in her bedroom closet. The children, ages 4, 6, and 8, kept asking her where they would put their Christmas tree. Harry sat on the floor with the Johnson children, listening as they described their Christmas wishes and their sadness about losing their toys and clothes. The youngest, Emma, told Harry that she had written a letter to Santa but worried that he wouldn't be able to find them since their house was gone. What happened next amazed everyone in the emergency center. Harry took out his phone and, right there in front of the children, called someone. The children and their grandmother watched in wonder as he had a conversation with what he claimed was one of Santa's helpers at the North Pole, explaining the situation and asking for special Christmas delivery assistance. The children's eyes grew wide as Harry spoke seriously into the phone about their circumstances, carefully spelling out their names and describing what they looked like so Santa wouldn't miss them. When he hung up, he assured them that Santa had been informed of their temporary new address and would definitely find them on Christmas morning. But Harry wasn't finished. While the children were distracted by other volunteers, he quietly spoke with Mrs. Johnson about their specific needs. He took careful notes about clothing sizes, favorite foods, and the children's interests. Then he made several more phone calls, these to toy stores and department stores around London. By evening, Harry had organized a complete Christmas miracle. Using his own money and calling in favors from friends and contacts, he arranged for emergency shopping trips that would replace not just the children's lost presents, but clothing, food, and household essentials for all the displaced families. Harry spent that night sleeping on a cot in the emergency shelter, refusing his security team's suggestions that he return to a hotel. He wanted to be there Christmas Eve morning when the donated items arrived, and he wanted to help distribute them personally to the families. Christmas Eve morning brought another surprise. Harry had arranged for several department stores to open early and deliver truckloads of presents, clothing, food, and household items. But more than that, he had contacted other members of his family and friends, organizing a small army of volunteers to help with the distribution. When the trucks arrived, Harry was there in his jeans and baseball cap, unloading boxes and organizing the gifts by family. He had personally ensured that every child would have presents to open on Christmas morning, and that every family would have a proper Christmas dinner. The Johnson children were beside themselves with excitement when Harry presented them with their gifts, telling them that Santa had made a special delivery just for them. Emma hugged Harry tightly, thanking him for helping Santa find them. The image of the prince being hugged by the small girl while surrounded by donated Christmas presents became one of the most beloved royal photographs ever taken. But perhaps the most touching moment came when Mrs. Johnson pulled Harry aside to thank him. With tears in her eyes, she told him that her grandchildren had been traumatized by the fire and had stopped talking about Christmas altogether. His kindness had restored their faith that good things could still happen, even after something terrible. The local media eventually caught wind of what Harry had done, but by then it was too late to turn it into a formal royal event. Instead, they captured something much more genuine: a prince who had abandoned protocol to spend Christmas Eve helping strangers, sleeping on a cot in an emergency shelter, and personally ensuring that homeless children would have a magical Christmas morning. The story spread quickly and donations poured in from around the world to help the fire victims. More importantly, Harry's actions inspired hundreds of other people to volunteer during the holidays, creating a wave of Christmas kindness that extended far beyond that single emergency shelter. Years later, the Johnson family still exchanges Christmas cards with Harry. Emma, now a teenager, often says that the prince taught her that real magic happens when people help each other. Mrs. Johnson framed the photo of Harry hugging Emma on Christmas Eve, and it still sits on their mantelpiece, as a reminder that sometimes angels come in the most unexpected forms. It was the autumn of 2019, and Prince Charles was scheduled to open a new community garden in Manchester. The project had been designed to bring fresh produce to an area where many families struggled to afford healthy food. As someone passionate about organic farming and environmental causes, Charles was genuinely excited about the visit, which was meant to be a celebration of community spirit and sustainable living. The garden had been months in the planning, created through a partnership between local volunteers, a charity organization, and the Prince's Trust. Families from the surrounding apartments had worked together to transform a patch of unused wasteland into neat rows of vegetables, herbs, and fruit trees. Children from the local school had painted colorful signs marking different growing areas. Charles arrived on a crisp October morning, dressed in his usual country attire and carrying a small trowel that he had brought from his own gardens at Highgrove. He was greeted by a group of excited volunteers, including several elderly residents who had become the garden's most dedicated caretakers. The atmosphere was festive, with children from the local school waiting to show him around their special project. The tour began well, with Charles examining the carefully tended vegetable patches and asking detailed questions about soil composition and growing techniques. He was impressed by the knowledge and dedication of the volunteers, many of whom had never gardened before starting this project. The children proudly showed him their sunflowers, some of which had grown taller than they were. Then the group reached the memorial section of the garden, an area that Charles hadn't been told about in his briefings. Here, among specially planted roses and flowering shrubs, were small plaques dedicated to community members who had passed away during the garden's development. The volunteers had created this space to honor neighbors they had lost, including several elderly residents who had died during the harsh winter months. One of the garden volunteers, an elderly woman named Rose, began to explain the memorial area to Charles. She pointed to a small plaque bearing the name Arthur Henderson and told Charles that Arthur had been the driving force behind the garden project, but had passed away from pneumonia just weeks before it was completed. Arthur had been 92 years old and had lived alone in one of the nearby apartments. Rose continued explaining that Arthur had spent every day at the garden site, despite his age and failing health. He had taught the younger volunteers how to prepare soil, when to plant different vegetables, and how to care for the fruit trees. His knowledge came from growing up on a farm in Yorkshire, and he had been eager to share everything he knew with his neighbors. Charles listened intently, as Rose described how Arthur had been particularly excited about the prince's planned visit. The old man had practiced what he wanted to say, had planned which vegetables to show off, and had even brought his best gardening tools to prepare the beds perfectly for the royal tour. He had told everyone that meeting Prince Charles would be the proudest moment of his life. As Rose spoke, her voice began to break. She explained that Arthur had worked in the garden just 3 days before his death, insisting on planting bulbs that wouldn't bloom until spring because he wanted the garden to be beautiful for years to come. He had worked despite having a terrible cough, refusing to go home until he had finished his tasks for the day. Charles stood quietly, looking down at Arthur's memorial plaque. The simple inscription read, "Arthur Henderson, 1927-2019, he made things grow." As the reality of Arthur's dedication and the tragedy of his timing sank in, Charles felt something break inside his chest. The group around him continued talking, but Charles could barely hear them. He was thinking about all the royal visits he had attended over the years, all the people who had prepared so carefully to meet him, and how many of those encounters he had rushed through without fully appreciating the effort involved. Rose mentioned that Arthur's greatest regret, expressed to her just days before he died, was that he wouldn't live to meet Prince Charles and show him what they had accomplished together. The old man had worried that no one would be able to explain the garden properly to the prince, that his lifetime of farming knowledge would be lost. That's when Charles completely lost his composure. Standing there among the memorial roses, surrounded by volunteers and schoolchildren, the future king began to cry, not the discreet tears that royals sometimes shed at very emotional moments, but deep, body-shaking sobs that surprised everyone present, including his own security detail. Charles knelt down beside Arthur's plaque, his shoulders shaking as he wept for a man he had never met, but who had dedicated his final months to creating something beautiful for his community. The assembled crowd stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do when a member of the royal family broke down so completely in public. Through his tears, Charles began to speak about the weight of knowing that people spent their final days preparing to meet him, about the guilt of missing connections with people who had invested their hearts in royal visits. He talked about Arthur's dedication and how it represented everything he admired about the British spirit, but also how it highlighted the burden of his position. One of the school children, a little girl named Lily, approached Charles with a handful of flowers she had picked from the garden. She offered them to him quietly, not understanding exactly why he was crying, but recognizing that he was sad. Charles accepted the flowers gratefully, holding them against Arthur's memorial plaque. Charles asked Rose to tell him more about Arthur, what he had been like as a person, what his favorite vegetables were, what stories he had shared about his farming days. For the next hour, Charles abandoned his scheduled itinerary and sat on a garden bench, listening to volunteers share memories of their lost friend. He learned that Arthur had been a widower for 20 years, that he had no remaining family, and that the community garden had given him purpose and friendship in his final months. The volunteers had become his surrogate family, and he had found joy in teaching them skills he had learned over a lifetime of working with the soil. Charles made a decision that day that surprised everyone. He announced that he would personally ensure that Arthur's agricultural knowledge was preserved and shared. He arranged for the volunteers to document all of Arthur's gardening advice and techniques, creating a manual that would be distributed to other community gardens around Britain. More than that, Charles established an annual award in Arthur's name, recognizing elderly volunteers who shared their knowledge and skills with younger generations. The Arthur Henderson Memorial Garden Award would become one of the most meaningful honors given by the Prince's Trust, celebrating people whose contributions might otherwise go unrecognized. The media coverage of Charles's breakdown was extensive and overwhelmingly positive. People appreciated seeing his genuine emotion and his recognition of Arthur's dedication. The story inspired similar community garden projects around the country, with many groups specifically requesting to include memorial areas for local volunteers. Years later, Charles would say that his visit to Arthur's garden was one of the most important days of his royal life. It taught him to slow down during engagements, to ask more questions about the people behind the projects, and to recognize that every person he meets has a story worth hearing. Arthur Henderson, whom he never met, had taught the future king one of his most valuable lessons about service and community. March 2020 was a difficult time for everyone in Britain. The country was entering its first lockdown due to the pandemic, and families everywhere were struggling with isolation, job losses, and uncertainty about the future. The royal family had retreated to their various residences, conducting most of their official duties virtually from home. Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, was managing her own family's adjustment to lockdown life while trying to maintain her royal duties through video calls and virtual appearances. Like many parents, she was juggling homeschooling her children with her responsibilities, finding the balance between being a mother and a working royal more challenging than ever. It was during this time that she received an unusual message through her private secretary. A woman named Jennifer from Kent had written a desperate letter, not asking for money or favors, but simply hoping that someone in authority might listen to her story. Jennifer's letter had somehow made its way through various channels to Kate's office, probably because it mentioned concerns about children during the pandemic. Jennifer's letter described how the lockdown was destroying her marriage. She and her husband David had been together for 15 years and had 2 young children, but the stress of being confined together while David lost his job and she tried to work from home was tearing them apart. They were arguing constantly. The children were picking up on the tension, and Jennifer was afraid their family was falling apart. What made Jennifer's situation particularly heartbreaking was that she and David had been trying so hard to make things work. They loved each other and their children deeply, but the pressure of the lockdown had brought out the worst in both of them. Jennifer wrote that she was considering asking David to move out, not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't see any other way to save their family. Kate was deeply moved by Jennifer's honesty and vulnerability. The letter reminded her of her own struggles during the early days of lockdown, when she and William had to navigate being together constantly while managing their official duties and caring for their children. She realized that if she and William, with all their resources and support, had found it challenging, families without those advantages must be suffering terribly. Instead of simply forwarding the letter to a charity or sending a standard response, Kate made an unprecedented decision. She would personally reach out to Jennifer and David, not as the Duchess of Cambridge conducting official business, but as one mother helping another family in crisis. Kate's first challenge was figuring out how to contact Jennifer without creating a media circus or raising expectations that she couldn't meet. She asked her private secretary to arrange a confidential phone call, emphasizing that this was to be kept completely private with no official record or media involvement. When Kate called Jennifer on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Jennifer initially thought it was a prank call. The idea that the Duchess of Cambridge would personally phone her seemed impossible. It took several minutes of conversation before Jennifer realized that the call was genuine, and when she did, she burst into tears of gratitude that someone had actually listened to her plea for help. Kate spent over an hour on that first call, listening as Jennifer poured out her heart about the deteriorating situation at home. Jennifer described how she and David had stopped communicating effectively, how they were both stressed about money, and how their 8-year-old daughter had started having nightmares because she could hear her parents arguing through the walls. What struck Kate most was Jennifer's self-awareness about the situation. She wasn't looking for someone to blame David or validate her anger. Instead, she genuinely wanted to find a way to save her marriage and create a stable home for her children. She just didn't know how to break the cycle of stress and conflict that had taken over their household. Kate asked Jennifer if she would be willing to include David in future conversations, explaining that she had learned from her own marriage that communication problems usually involved both partners. Jennifer was hesitant at first, worried that David would be embarrassed or defensive about discussing their private problems with a member of the royal family. The next week, Kate called again, this time speaking with both Jennifer and David on speakerphone. David was clearly uncomfortable at first, but Kate's genuine warmth and lack of judgment gradually put him at ease. She shared some of her own experiences with the challenges of balancing work and family life, making it clear that she understood the pressures they were facing. Over the course of several weeks, Kate developed what could only be described as an informal counseling relationship with Jennifer and David. She would call them every few days, sometimes just to check in, other times to work through specific conflicts they were experiencing. She drew on her own experiences, advice she had received from marriage counselors, and techniques she had learned through her work with children's mental health charities. Kate's approach wasn't to give direct advice, but rather to ask questions. That helped Jennifer and David understand each other's perspectives. She helped them recognize that they were both grieving the loss of their normal routine and taking their frustrations out on each other, instead of supporting one another through a difficult time. One of the breakthrough moments came when Kate asked David to describe what he missed most about his relationship with Jennifer before the lockdown. David broke down as he talked about how much he missed making Jennifer laugh, and how the stress had made him forget all the things he loved about his wife. Jennifer was crying too as she listened to her husband rediscover his feelings for her. Through his conversation with Kate, Kate also helped them develop practical strategies for managing their household during lockdown. She shared techniques for creating personal space in a small home, suggested ways to involve their children in family activities that would reduce tension, and even recommended specific times for difficult conversations when the children were occupied. The most remarkable thing about Kate's intervention was how she managed to maintain it secretly while continuing her official royal duties. She would make these personal calls between virtual engagements, often from her private sitting room at Anmer Hall. Her staff knew she was making confidential calls, but weren't aware of the details, and Kate never mentioned her project to anyone, including William. After 6 weeks of regular conversations, Jennifer and David reported that their relationship had not only stabilized, but was actually stronger than it had been before the pandemic. They had learned to communicate more effectively, to support each other during stressful times, and to work together as a team rather than letting external pressures drive them apart. Kate's final conversation with the couple came in late May 2020, when restrictions were beginning to ease. Jennifer and David wanted to thank her for saving their marriage, but Kate insisted that they had done all the hard work themselves. She had simply provided a safe space for them to rediscover what they meant to each other. The couple asked if they could somehow repay Kate's kindness, perhaps through a donation to one of her charities. Instead, Kate asked them to do something different. She requested that they share their story with other couples who might be struggling, to let people know that relationship difficulties during the pandemic were normal and that help was available. Jennifer and David began volunteering with a local relationship counseling service, offering peer support to other couples experiencing lockdown stress. They never revealed Kate's role in their recovery, but they became passionate advocates for seeking help during difficult times rather than suffering in silence. Kate continued to receive occasional updates from Jennifer through her private secretary, learning about the family's progress and their volunteer work. She felt a deep satisfaction knowing that her decision to break protocol and personally help one family had created ripple effects that helped many others. The story of Kate's secret counseling work never became public during the pandemic, and might never have been known if Jennifer hadn't eventually shared it years later, when asked about successful support systems during lockdown. Even then, she was careful to emphasize Kate's humanity rather than her royal status, describing her as a mother who understood what we were going through and cared enough to help. This hidden chapter in Kate's royal service demonstrated something profound about the nature of true leadership and compassion. Sometimes the most important work happens in complete privacy, with no recognition or praise, driven simply by the desire to help another human being in need. Kate had broken every rule of royal engagement by becoming personally involved in a stranger's private life. But in doing so, she had embodied the very best of what it means to serve others.